Hey listeners, Rob here, Head of Research at 80,000 Hours. I think you're going to be hearing a lot about the book that Mustafa and I are discussing today, The Coming Wave, Technology, Power, and the 21st Century's Greatest Dilemma, which was just released very recently. Mustafa Suleyman was a co-founder of DeepMind, and on top of promoting the book, he also has this enormous new AI company, Inflection AI, to run, so we only got an hour to chat with him. Given that time constraint, I tried to focus on topics where Mustafa's 10 years at DeepMind might give him something of a unique perspective, as well as questions related to his new AI company, such as whether it might be making risks from AI worse, as well as how he hopes it might at some point help. Just to give you a bit of background on Mustafa, though, when young, he went to Oxford University, but he dropped out to help start the Muslim Youth Helpline, as well as work on human rights policy with the Mayor of London. But in 2010, as I mentioned, he helped found one of the world's top AI labs, DeepMind, along with his childhood friend, Demis Hassabis. And in 2014, DeepMind was acquired by Google, and he became head of applied AI at DeepMind, while in 2019, he left DeepMind to take up a policy role in the Google parent company. But more recently, in 2022, Mustafa left Google to found Inflection AI, along with LinkedIn founder Reid Hoffman. And since then, Inflection has received over $1 billion in investment, and it's working to build one of the world's largest supercomputers. It's focused on building a helpful chatbot that's hopefully more personal, offering emotional support and humor more than the alternatives out there. And ideally, over time, it's also going to remember past conversations and gradually get more context about you and your activities, or the user and the user's activities. The hope being that it's going to grow into being a bit of a mix of a therapist, a supportive friend, a business consultant, and I guess an executive assistant, depending on what you want. They call this project and service Pi for personal AI. And if you like, you could give it a go at personal.ai. This month, though, Mustafa and co-author Michael Bhaskar are publishing their new book, The Coming Wave, Technology, Power, and the 21st Century's Greatest Dilemma, which I have to say is an absolutely bracing read because it makes the case that we're about to enter a period of dizzying, very rapid technological change, which on the one hand could greatly improve the human condition, but on the other could also lead humanity towards disaster in any one of a dozen different ways, themes that should be pretty familiar to regular listeners to the show. Thanks for coming on the podcast, Mustafa.
Thanks very much for having me. It's great to be here. I've long been a fan of the podcast and the movement. So
wonderful.
It's great. Yeah.
I hope to talk about how you intend for Inflection AI to help solve the problems described in The Coming Wave, and what you would like governments to require of AI labs. But first, I asked our audience to send in questions for you, and a recurring one was wanting to clarify when you think we'll have different AI capabilities. So you've been quoted in some articles as saying that it's plausible. It's a very difficult question, but yeah, you've been quoted in some articles as saying it's plausible that within 2 years, ML models will be able to autonomously operate an online business and turn $100,000 into $1 million over the period of a couple of months, it's a potentially super significant threshold that you highlight in the book, which you call the modern Turing test. Now that I guess we've just completely blasted past the normal old Turing test. Now, to me, being able to run a business that turns $100,000 into $1 million sounds super impressive, and it's a very general task that involves engaging in a wide range of different activities and figuring out how to do them in some sensible order, and I guess having superhuman performance, at least when it comes to the bottom line. At the same time, there's another interview where you said you agreed that we might well want to slow down advances in AI capabilities once they were getting close to getting dangerous, but you didn't foresee that being necessary for maybe another 10 years or so. Those two views feel in some tension to me and some listeners. Yeah, can you clarify what you think about all of that?
So I think, there's an important clarification, which is a sort of cheeky addition, but is very significant, which I put in the modern Turing test, both in my articles, my tweets, and also in the book, which is that I said it's plausible that could happen in 2 years with minor human oversight. Right. So there would be significant steps along that path where the human would have to, register a company, manage the bank account. Ultimately, there will be a bunch of things that wouldn't be done completely autonomously. The individual components could be done autonomously. You could imagine the AI being given a general instruction to make up a product that was likely to be valuable and useful to people, to generate that, to write all the communications required to go off and have that manufactured, to negotiate over the price, to identify a drop shipper, et cetera, et cetera. All of that could potentially happen.
Yeah, what's the thing that would potentially make a model dangerous, but you think is going to be lacking or likely to be lacking in 2 years' time, or whenever we have the kind of model that you think has the capability to run a business in that way?
Well, look, I think it's really important, especially for this audience, to distinguish between the model itself being dangerous and the potential uses of these technologies enabling people who have bad intentions to do serious harm at scale, right? And they're really fundamentally different, because going back to your first question, the reason I said that I don't see any evidence that we're on a trajectory where we have to slow down capabilities development because there's a chance of, runaway intelligence explosion or runaway recursive self-improvement or some inherent property of the model on a standalone basis having the potential, in and of itself to cause mass harm. I still don't see that, and I stand by, a decade time frame. I mean, to me, I know that we in the AGI safety community are obsessed with timelines. It's just like the number one discussion whenever I go to any of these. So what is your timeline? Has it updated, et cetera, et cetera? I remember going to the Winter Intelligence Conference in Oxford in 2011. I think it might have been the first proper convening. It might have been 2012. I can't remember, of an AGI safety kind of conference. And at the end, it was sort of a day-long event, and people handed around this scrappy sheet of paper. I think it was one paper that got passed around, and everybody hand wrote their timelines for AGI. And obviously the spectrum was huge. It was kind of a funny test. So, the timelines question obviously is super important. I don't mean to trivialize it. It is just funny how obsessed we get about it. And I think that we're actually really, really bad at making these estimates. So when I say 10 years, what I'm actually saying is, I'm not saying, 10 years instead of 8 or instead of 12. I'm saying it's a long enough time horizon that I would consider it medium term and hard for me to predict in anything other than blocks of time, like short, medium, or very far out being 20 years plus. But I think it's medium, and I think that's in itself a serious, risk that I'm giving a non-trivial percentage to some kind of existential threat over a decade. So just, I take it very seriously. I'm not trying to trivialize it or anything.
Yeah. Okay, so maybe the idea is in the short term, over the next couple of years, we need to worry about misuse, where a model with human assistance directed to do bad things, that's an imminent issue. Whereas a model running somewhere out of control and acting more autonomously without human support and against human efforts to control it, that is more something that we might think about in 10 years' time and beyond. That's
definitely my take. That is the key distinction between misuse and autonomy, right? And I think that there are some capabilities which we need to track, because those capabilities increase the likelihood that that 10-year event might be sooner, right? So for example, if models are designed to have the ability to operate autonomously by default, right? So there, as an inherent design requirement, we're engineering the ability to go off and design its own goals, to learn to use arbitrary tools, to really make decisions completely independently of human oversight. And then the second capability related to that is obviously recursive self-improvement. If models are designed to update their own code, to retrain themselves, and produce fresh weights as a result of new fine-tuning data or new interaction data of any kind from their environment, be it simulated or real world. These are the kinds of capabilities that should give us pause for thought.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, what do you think is going to, I mean, I guess you would know better than me. My feeling is that quite a lot of people are working on trying to figure out how they can turn these models into autonomous agents that, can act with progressively less human oversight. What do you think is going to hold it back that means that we won't, have really useful examples of that for another 10 years?
Well, I don't think we'll have useful examples of that. I think that we may be working on those capabilities, but they won't necessarily represent an existential threat. I think what I'm saying is they indicate the beginning of a trajectory towards a greater threat, right? And, at Inflection, we're actually not working on either of those capabilities, recursive self-improvement and autonomy. And I've chosen a product direction which I think can enable us to be extremely successful without needing to work on that. I mean, we're not an AGI company. We're not trying to build a super intelligence. We're trying to build a personal AI. Now, that is going to have, very capable, AI-like qualities. It is going to learn from human feedback. It is going to, synthesize information for you in ways that seem magical and surprising. It's going to have a lot of access to your personal information. But I think the quest to build general purpose learning agents which have the ability to perform well in a wide range of environments, that can operate autonomously, that can formulate their own goals, that can learn from, that can identify, new information in environments, new reward signals, and learn to use that as self-supervision to update their own weights over time. This is a completely different quality of agent that is quite different, I think, to a personal AI product.
Yeah. Recently, there's been this big debate over the open sourcing of frontier ML models. Facebook has kind of persisted in publishing the weights for progressively more advanced large language models, despite worries from US lawmakers about how they might be misused and whether it's so smart to make a habit of handing over strategic technology to American adversaries like China. And while Facebook, they tuned their models to try to make it them less likely to be willing to help with criminal behavior. Once you have the raw weights, it's really trivial to get rid of any tuning like that and so you can kind of get the model to do whatever you want. And once you've given out the weights, you've kind of ceded any control over that. What's your personal take on a model open sourcing?
Well, first of all, I mean, you've raised three different things there. I'm not sure I would agree that it's trivial to remove the fine tuning and alignment, right? So That's one question. Second thing is, should we be like, what is the logic of denying China access to frontier technologies? What are the consequences of that? What does that mean for, global stability and the potential of real conflict? And then third, is your question around open source, right? So let me kind of just go in reverse order. On the open source thing, look, I think I've come out quite clearly pointing out the risks of large scale access. I think I called it naive open source in 20 years time. Right. So that what that means is if we just continue to open source absolutely everything for every new generation of frontier models, then it's quite likely that we're going to see a rapid proliferation of power. I mean, these are state-like powers which enable small groups of actors or maybe even individuals to have, an unprecedented one-to-many impact in the world. Just as in the last wave of social media, it sort of enabled anybody to have broadcast powers, anybody to essentially function as an entire newspaper, from the 90s. By the 2000s, you could have millions of followers, on Twitter or Instagram or whatever. And, you're really influencing the world in a way that was previously the preserve of a publisher that in most cases was licensed and regulated, that was an authority that could be held accountable if it really did something egregious. And all of that has now kind of fallen away for good, by the way, reasons, and in some cases with bad consequences. We're going to see the same trajectory with respect to access to the ability to influence the world. I mean, you can think of it as related to my modern Turing test that I proposed around, artificial capable AI, like machines that go from being evaluated on the basis of what they say, the imitation test of the original Turing test, to evaluating machines on the basis of what they can do. Can they use APIs? How persuasive are they of other humans? Can they interact with other AIs to get them to do things, right? So if everybody gets that power, that starts to look like, individuals having the power of organizations or even states. I'm talking about models that are like 2 or 3 orders of magnitude, maybe 4 orders of magnitude on from where we are. And we're not far away from that. We're going to be training models that are 1,000x larger than they currently are in the next 3 years. I mean, even at inflection with the compute that we have, we'll be 100x larger than the current frontier models in the next 18 months. So that story, I mean, although I took a lot of heat on the open source thing, I clearly wasn't talking about today's models. I was talking about future generations, and I still think it's right. And I stand by that, because I think that if we don't have that conversation, then we end up, basically putting massively chaotic, destabilizing tools in the hands of absolutely everybody. How you do that in practice, somebody referred to it as like trying to, catch rainwater, trying to stop rain by catching it in your hands, which I think is a very good rebuttal. It's absolutely spot on. Of course, this is insanely hard, right? And I'm not saying that it's not, difficult. I'm saying that it's the conversation that we have to be having, right?
Yeah. How difficult is it in practice to remove the fine tuning? I guess I was overstating it when I said it was trivial. I suppose it requires a bunch of technical chops, and you have to do a bunch of reinforcement learning from human feedback to kind of undo the constraints that have been put on the models. Is that the picture?
Correct. Yeah. I mean, I think it's pretty hard. I think it's actually certainly not trivial, and I think it requires significant expertise. And I think the other thing to think about is a lot of this, so one of the examples that we all have surfaced, to the authorities is to do with bio and chemical weapons development, right? I mean, this clearly lowers the barrier to entry to being able to develop, a potentially dangerous, synthetic compound of some type, like maybe a weapon or maybe a pathogen or something like this. Now, that's for sure true. It's like it can act as a coach, trying to, nudge you along your path as you actually put this together, where to get the tools from when you run into technical challenges in the lab and so on. So I think it's for sure possible to remove that content both from pre-training to align it out, etc., and really, really lower the risk of people being able to do that. And I think it will be hard to re-expose those capabilities in models after the fact, even from open source. I mean, I'm not 100% sure on that, but I think it's going to be pretty hard. It definitely makes it much, much harder than just leaving it in there. But I think the second thing to think about is this knowledge and expertise is already available all over the web. So with bad actors, all we're trying to do is just make it as hard as we possibly can. You can't completely eliminate the risk. So at some point you have to ask yourself, what is the new risk that we have exposed by making a model like this available that isn't already, a risk that we are exposed to given the accessibility of this information on the open web, which is clearly there, right? And I think that for open sourcing Llama 2, I personally don't see that we've increased the existential risk to the world or any catastrophic harm to the world in a material way whatsoever. I think it's actually good that they're out there.
Interesting. Yeah. So I agree with that. I'm not worried about. I mean, I think that the current models, the bad outcomes would mostly be that they could be a nuisance in some way. They could help with scamming people or something. But I'm concerned about having this precedent where people just say we have to open source everything. And then well, where does that leave us in 5 years or 10 years or 15 years or 20 years? They're gonna just keep getting more powerful, And currently, it's kind of not really that much. It's not really any help with designing a bioweapon. But in 10 years' time or 15 years' time, it might be able to really make a really substantial difference. And yeah, I'm just not sure. I feel like we have to start putting some restrictions on open sourcing now, basically in anticipation of that.
I think that's totally correct, and I think that unfortunately there's a lot of extreme anger in the open source community to that, which I can completely understand because it's affordable, anyone can experiment with it, it has been the engine of progress in the past, and it's also not great coming from someone like me that has raised lots and lots of money and that has the opportunity to do this. So I totally appreciate the kind of seemingly basically contradictory position where I'm just reinforcing my own success kind of thing. So I totally accept that. Unfortunately, I still believe I'm right. So I'm genuinely sincerely committed to the right thing, even though it is a bit of a total conflict of interest. So hopefully other people can make this argument too.
Yeah. Well, I don't run an AI company, and I think you're right. So
thank you.
So maybe I'm more credible. What about the geopolitical angle? Do you think that it's possible that national security folks who think that AI is very strategic are going to take an interest in reducing open sourcing because they see it as handing over a strategically important technology to other countries?
I think that's going to be quite likely. From all of my conversations over the last couple of years in the US, to some extent also in the UK. I can see that there's just, we've shifted from seeing the China as a strategic adversary, which is a phrase that implies that we can get along with one another, but it will be a little bit of jostling and we'll be competitors, to, seeing it as a fundamental threat, right? So, the export controls from last year, were really a declaration of economic war. I mean, we can haggle over whether the H800 enables them to do, just about as much training compute as we can with an H100. I mean, I think in practice, it probably slows them down by 30 to 50% because the H800 can still be daisy chained together like the rest of the chips. And so you can really just buy 50% more of them, which I think is what a number of these companies have done. So I don't, I don't see them being held back a great deal by this. However, they are going to be flatly denied access to the next generation. So Hopper Next is going to be completely nuts. I mean, it's a really, really powerful chip. So I think that's where people should focus their attention. It is a really significant block on their progress, and it's very difficult for them to catch up by building other chips from scratch and so on. So yeah, it's really going to slow them down, and it's not going to go unpunished. I mean, they've already hit back with sanctions of their own on some of the raw materials like galenium, and also on Supermicro and stuff. So I expect to see more of that.
Yeah. While you were involved with DeepMind and Google, you tried to get a broader range of people involved in decision making on AI, at least in as much as it affected broader society. But in the book, you describe how those efforts more or less came to naught. How high a priority is solving that problem relative to the other challenges that you talk about in the book?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I honestly spent a huge amount of my time over the sort of 10 years that I was at DeepMind, trying to put more external oversight as a core function of governance in the way that we build these technologies. And it was a pretty painful exercise. I mean, naturally, power doesn't want that. And although I think Google is sort of well-intentioned, it still, functions as a kind of traditional bureaucracy. And unfortunately, I think when we did start to make some progress on it, like for example, when we set up the Google ethics board, it was really in a climate when cancel culture was at its absolute peak. And our view was that we would basically have these sort of 9 independent members that, could, although they didn't have, legal powers to block a technology or to, investigate beyond their scope, they were dependent on, what we as Google DeepMind showed them. It still was a significant step to providing external oversight on, sensitive technologies that we were developing. But, I think people, some people on Twitter and elsewhere felt that because we had appointed a conservative, the president of the Heritage Foundation, and she had made some transphobic and homophobic remarks in the past, quite serious ones, that meant that she should be cancelled and she should be withdrawn from the board, and so within a few days of announcing it, people started campaigning on university campuses to force other people to step down from the board because their presence on the board was complicit and implied that they condoned her views and stuff like this. And I just think that was a complete travesty and really, really upsetting, because we'd spent 2 years trying to get this board going, and it was a first step towards real outside scrutiny over very sensitive technologies that were being developed. And unfortunately, it all ended within a week, and as 3 members of the 9 stood down, and then eventually she stood down, and then we lost half the board in a week, and it was just completely untenable. And then the company turned around and were like, well, why are we messing around with this? This is a waste of time.
What a pain in the
Why
butt.
would we bother?
Yeah.
What a pain in the ass.
Yeah. So yeah. It was a very striking story to me reading that in the book. Maybe people complain, I think correctly, that in issues or decisions of enormous global importance, historical importance, are potentially going to be made inside these AI labs. And the kinds of people who work at these labs are a very small fraction of the people in the world in terms of their political views, the values that they have, the things that they've studied, the kind of information that they happen to know. And so it would be good if we could get a wider cross section of the human population involved in scrutinizing or having some input on these. But to share power with the general public in the global south, or even just outside big cities in the US or UK, will inevitably involve giving influence to people with views that I imagine are very offensive to Google staff, probably more offensive than Kay Coles James, who had to resign from the board for having more conservative traditional views on gender. Yeah. So based on that experience, it just seems like it's very unlikely to happen, and when we might just be flat out trying to get acceptance for having more input from a broader cross section of educated people in the UK into Google. Like that's going to be the most that people will tolerate.
Yeah, I mean, totally. I mean, this is part of the problem, right? I mean, 40% of people in the US, believe that abortion, should be made illegal, right? 40% believe that, trans rights are moving too quickly. 30% believe that abortion is legal. 30% are against gay marriage. I mean, none of these views
and then think globally, right?
Right, exactly. Then think globally. So I think we have to, just learn to sit down with people who we fundamentally disagree with. I mean, that goes for China and, the Taliban and, all these people who hold these views, because if we can't do that, then we've really got no chance of actually, hearing one another out and changing one another's views and making progress. And I think the last 2 or 3 years, I feel like we've really taken a few backward steps in that direction, and it's super problematic. It's because it just demonizes the other, and then we just end up hating on one another, and it's very frustrating for us because we put a huge amount of effort to make that happen. Before that, when we were acquired, we made it a condition of the acquisition that we have an ethics and safety board. That in itself was a first step towards this kind of broader public effort. Then after the ethics and safety board, we actually tried to spin DeepMind out as a global interest company, one that was legally governed by, the requirement to, consider all of the stakeholders when making decisions. So it was a company limited by guarantee. And then the charter definition, had an ethics and safety mission for AGI development. We actually had the ability to spend vast amounts of our income on, scientific and social mission. So it was a really creative and experimental structure. But when there's, sort of Alphabet saw what happened with that board, they basically just got cold feet. That was the bottom line. They saw what happened there and they were just like, this is totally nuts. This is the same thing's going to happen for your global interest company. Why do that? And then eventually we pulled DeepMind into Google, and in a way, like DeepMind was never independent and isn't independent now. Obviously now it's like completely, part of Google.
Yeah. I mean, it is just the core of trying to address representativeness is that you will be ceding power to people who don't share your values, and if people are not willing to make that compromise, that is not going to happen. Like, what do you think might be an incremental step that is realistic for some of these labs to get more input from broader society?
Well, I'm really stuck. I think it's really hard. Like, there is another direction, which involves the sort of academic groups getting more access and, either actually doing red teaming or, doing audits of scale or audits of model capabilities, right? They're the three proposals that I've heard made and I've been very supportive of and have certainly explored with people at Stanford and elsewhere. But I think there's a real problem there, which is if you take the average PhD student or postdoctoral researcher that might work on this, in a couple of years, they may well go to a commercial lab, right? And so if we're to give them access, then they'll probably take that knowledge and expertise, elsewhere, potentially to a competitor. I mean, it's an open labor market after all. So that isn't really a sustainable way of doing it. I met with Jen Easterly a few weeks ago, who runs the US cyber security agencies. And she and I were talking about maybe using more traditional pen testing consultants to do red teaming, because they have a commercial incentive in keeping the information top secret. They've been cleared for a long time. They're trusted, but at the same time they can make independent public statements about compliance with various standards or not. And I kind of prefer that direction in a way, because they're clearly incentivized not to leak that information, and it's a sort of more commercial outfit. We did have a pretty cool hybrid thing going at DeepMind for a while with Toby Ord. But I think Toby is an exceptional individual. I mean, he's clearly been an EA since before EAs were a thing. And we've let him come and visit DeepMind when I was there, at least pretty much every week for years. But he's not an engineer. He's committed his life to being, an EA monk. And so, and also I'm not even sure like how much impact that actually has in practice. I mean, I think he's a good person to have around, but I don't think that's like a practical oversight mechanism.
We need more than that.
That's what I'm saying.
More than one guy. Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. Totally. Yeah, exactly.
Another experience that you share in the coming wave is trying to sound the alarm about the likely social effects of AI to your colleagues many years ago, and kind of being met with disinterest and blank stares. And some people in the tech industry, I guess probably a shrinking number now, still seem to have the attitude that everything is just very likely to be fine, and all we have to do is advance everything as quickly as possible. And the central theme of your book is just that it might not be as simple as that. Over the years, have you found any arguments that are persuasive and get skeptics in your industry to kind of sit up straight and take seriously the idea that we're closer to doing a tightrope walking act rather than just racing down a straight runway?
That is a great question. Strategies for persuading people to care more about this issue. The interesting thing is that when I wrote that, the first part of the book that mentions this idea of pessimism aversion, right, which is something that I've experienced my whole career. Like, I've always felt like the weirdo in the corner who's, sort of raising the alarm and kind of saying, hold on a second, we have to be cautious. Obviously, lots of people listening to this podcast will probably be familiar with that, because we're all a little bit more fringe. But certainly in Silicon Valley, like, that kind of thing, I get called a decel sometimes, which I actually had to look up, which actually means, I guess it's a play on me being an incel, which obviously I'm not, and some kind of decelerationist, or Luddite or something, which is obviously also bananas given like what I'm actually doing in my company.
Extraordinary accusation. Yeah.
It's funny, isn't it? So yeah, I mean, people have this fear, particularly in the US, of pessimistic outlooks. I mean, the number of times, people come to me and be like, well, you seem to be quite pessimistic. It's like, no, I just don't think about things in this simplistic, are you an optimist or are you a pessimist? This is just a terrible framing. It's like BS. I'm neither. Yeah. I'm just observing the facts as I see them, and I'm doing my best to share for critical public scrutiny what I see. If I'm wrong, rip it apart and let's debate it, but let's not sort of like lean into these biases either way. So in terms of things that I've found productive in these conversations is, frankly, the national security people are much more sober. And the way to get their head around things is to talk about misuse. I mean, they see things in terms of bad actors, non-state actors, threats to the nation state. And so in the book, I've really tried to frame this as implications for the nation state and stability. Because, at one level, whether you're, progressive or otherwise, we care about the ongoing stability of our current order. We really don't want to live in this like Mad Maxian, hyper-libertarian, chaos post-nation state world. The nation state, I think we can all agree, that a shackled Leviathan does a good job of like putting constraints on, the chaotic emergence of bad power, and uses that to do redistribution in a way that keeps peace and prosperity, going. So I think that there's general alignment around that, and if you make clear that this has the potential to be misused, I think that's effective. What wasn't effective, I can tell you, was the obsession with superintelligence. Mm-hmm. I honestly think that did a seismic distraction, if not disservice, to the actual debate. Like, there was many more practical things, because I think a lot of people who heard that in policy circles just thought, well, this is not for me. This is a completely speculative. What do you mean recursive self-improvement? What do you mean like AGI, superintelligence taking over? Like the number of people who barely have heard the phrase AGI but know about paperclips it's just unbelievable. Like, people completely non-technical people would be like, yeah, I've heard about the paperclip thing. What, you think that's likely? I'm like, oh, geez, that is stop talking about paperclips.
Yeah.
So I think avoid that side of things, focus on misuse.
Yeah. I suppose it seems like the paperclip thing is now more in the Overton window, or the superintelligence is now. You get fewer people thinking that that's crazy today, having seen the advances in the last year. Just say, well, imagine that we saw the progress of the last year, but it happened another 10 times for the next 10 years.
100%. Yeah, that's the crazy thing. I certainly agree with that. The last year's been pretty crazy, and so
yeah. And in 2010, I guess it was an idea ahead of its time potentially, where maybe that was the thing to worry about happening in 2040 or 2050, but it was just causing too many people to bounce because it wasn't clear that you could do what to do.
Yeah, and well, frankly, I would say even 2015, 2018, 2020, I think it was premature for those kinds of things and sort of isolated people that we wanted to get on our side. Obviously, now it's kind of easy. I mean, that's the easiest way to demonstrate, and persuade people that this is important. It's like make things available in open source, have a bunch of people play with it, identify the actual limitations and potential capabilities of these models in practice. And then we can all have a rational, sane debate about, real things rather than sort of theoretical frameworks. And I think we're actually in a really good place on that front in terms of AGI safety. Like, I think it's never been, sort of more well understood and more, like, I feel great relief. Yeah. I feel great relief at this point. I'm like, amazing. The cat's out of the bag. Everybody can make their own mind up. I don't, this tiny group of us don't actually have to sort of make the theoretical case or speculate, because everyone can just, like you say, 10x or 100x what they see in their favorite chatbot and, take it from there.
Yeah. From your many years in the industry, do you understand the internal politics of AI labs that have staff who range all the way from being incredibly worried about AI advances to people who just think that there's no problem at all and just want everything to go as quickly as possible? I would have, as an outsider, expected that these groups would end up in conflict over strategy pretty often, but at least from my vantage point, I haven't heard about that happening very much. Things seem to run remarkably smoothly.
I think the general view of people who really care about AI safety inside labs, like myself and others at OpenAI and some extent, well, to a large extent, DeepMind too, I think is that the only way that you can really make progress on safety is that you actually have to be building it. And unless you are at the coal face, really like experimenting with, the latest capabilities, and you have resources to actually try to mitigate some of the harms that you see arising in those capabilities, then you're always going to be playing catch up by a couple of years. I mean, I'm pretty confident that open source is going to consistently stay 2 to 3 years behind the frontier for quite a while, like at least the next 5 years. I mean, at some point there really will be mega, multi-billion-dollar training runs. But I actually think we're farther away from that than people realize. I mean, I think people's math is often wrong on these things. Like, people talk about us getting to a $10 billion training run. I mean, that math does not add up. We're not getting to a single training run that costs $10 billion. I mean, that is many years away, 5 years away at least.
Yeah. Is it maybe that they're thinking that it'll have the equivalent compute of $10 billion in like 2022 chips or something like that? Is maybe that where the confusion's coming in, that they're thinking about it in terms of like the compute increase, because they may be thinking, well, I think there's going to be a training run that involves 100 times as much compute. But the thing is, by the time that happens, it doesn't cost anywhere near 100 times as much money.
Well, partly it's that. I mean, it could well be that, but then it will be 2 to 3x less, right? So it's not going to be 10x less. It'll be 2 to 3x less because each new generation of chip roughly gives you 2 to 3x more flops per dollar. But yeah, I've heard that number bandied around, and I can't figure out how you squeeze $10 billion worth of training into 6 months, and unless you're going to train for 3 years or something, maybe. But like,
that's unlikely.
Yeah, it's pretty unlikely. So, but in any case, I think it is super interesting that open source is so close, and it's not just open source as a result of open sourcing frontier models like Llama 2, or Falcon or these things. It is more interesting actually that these models are going to get smaller and more efficient to train. So if you consider that, like, GPT-3 was 175 billion parameters in the summer of 2020, right? So it's like 3 years ago. And people are now training GPT-3 like capabilities at 1.5 billion parameters or 2 billion parameters, which is still may cost a fair amount to train because the total training compute doesn't go down hugely, but certainly the serving compute goes down a lot. And therefore many more people can use those models and more cheaply and therefore experiment with them. And I think that trajectory to me feels like it's going to continue for at least the next 3 to 5 years.
Yeah. But I guess the broader point was that even people who are concerned feel like they need to be at the frontier in order to be understanding these models better and figuring out how to make them safer. So that's the reason why kind of everyone is able to get along potentially, because they all have an intermediate goal in common.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess on that general theme, a recurring question submitted by listeners was ran along these lines, basically, that you're clearly alarmed about advances in AI capabilities in the book, and you're worried that policy is lagging behind. And in the book, you propose all kinds of different policies for containment, like auditing and using choke points to slow things down. And you say we need to find ways of buying time, slowing down, giving, I think a literal quote, finding ways of buying time, slowing down, giving space for more work on the answers. But at the same time, your company is building one of the largest supercomputers in the world, and you think over the next 18 months, you might do a language model training run that's 10x or 100x larger than the one that produced GPT-4. Like, isn't it possible that your own actions are helping to speed up the race towards dangerous capabilities that you wish were not going on?
So I don't think that's correct for a number of reasons. First, I think the primary threat to the stability of the nation state is not the existence of these models themselves, or indeed the existence of these models with the capabilities that I mentioned. The primary threat to the nation state is the proliferation of power, right? It's the proliferation of power which is likely to cause catastrophe and chaos, right? Centralized power has a different threat, which is also equally bad and needs to be taken care of, which is authoritarianism and the misuse of that centralized power, which I care very deeply about, right? So that's for sure. But I'm not in the, as we said earlier, I'm not in the kind of AGI, sort of intelligence explosion camp that I think that just by developing models with these capabilities, suddenly it sort of gets out of the box, deceives us, persuades us to go and get access to more resources, gets to, sort of inadvertently update its own goals. I think this kind of anthropomorphism is the wrong metaphor. I think it is a distraction. There are these overwhelming incentives which drive the creation of these models, these huge geopolitical incentives, the huge desire to research these things in open source, as we've just discussed, so the entire ecosystem of creation defaults to production, right? Me not participating does not reduce, certainly doesn't, reduce the likelihood that these models get developed. So I think the best thing that we can do is try to develop them and do so safely. And at the moment when we do need to step back from specific capabilities, like the ones I mentioned, recursive self-improvement and autonomy, then I will and we should.
So just to clarify, on the misalignment risk, or the risk of the model being dangerous even to train, you think that doing a 100x training run that's kind of just still producing a chatbot, like a better GPT-4, even though that would be a more impressive model and a more capable model, presumably, it's not dangerous because it's lacking essential components like autonomy and the ability to act in the world. Like just producing an extremely good and a much better GPT-4, it's not dangerous yet. In order for it to be dangerous, we need to add other capabilities like it acting in the world and having broader goals. And that's like 5, 10, 15, 20 years away. We don't know exactly. But for that reason, it's not dangerous right now. And then you, in terms of encouraging other people to do stuff that's dangerous, like advancing capabilities more quickly than would like, you just think that Inflection AI, even if it's a big deal in this business ecosystem, the incentives are so clear. Everyone already wants to race ahead, such that they're not like watching you and changing their behavior based on that very much. They're going to do the thing that they're going to do just because they think it's profitable for them. And if you held back on doing that training run, it wouldn't shift their behavior.
I think that's absolutely right. And the fact that we're at the table, like for example, at the White House recently signing up to the voluntary commitments, one of 7 companies in the US signing up to those commitments, means that we're able to shape the distribution of outcomes, to put the question of ethics and safety, at the forefront in those kinds of discussions. So I think you get to shape the Overton window when it's available to you because you're a participant and a player. And I think that's true for everybody. I think everybody who is thinking about AI safety and is motivated by these concerns should be trying to operationalize their alignment intentions, their alignment goals, right? You have to actually make it in practice to prove that it's possible. I mean, if people have an opportunity to play with Pi, right? Pi is our AI, our personal AI. Stands for personal intelligence. You can find it at pi.ai on the web and on the App Store. You'll see that we've aligned it in very, very specific ways. It isn't susceptible to any of the jailbreaks or prompt hacks, any of them. If anybody gets one, send it to me on Twitter. We don't suffer any of them. Why is that? Because we've made safety and behavior alignment our number one priority, and we've deliberately designed the model not to be general, right? So it doesn't generate code, right? It isn't designed to be the ultimate general purpose API that anybody can quote unquote prompt. It's a personal AI that you can talk to. Now, that doesn't mean it doesn't have any risks, right? It has other risks, right? Which are, okay, what are the values of this AI? Is it being persuasive? What kinds of conversations are people having with it? So there are other considerations that we have to be attentive to, but starting from a position of building these personal AIs with safety and ethics in mind is actually a core value of our company, and I think shows in the product that we built.
Yeah, so Inflection AI primarily works on developing these hopefully much, much better chatbots. And it feels a little bit distant from many of the concerns that you lay out in the coming wave. Yeah, could you elaborate a bit more on kind of what is the vision for how Inflection is going to help tackle those threats that you're really worried about?
Well, I mean, most of the threats that I've described are actually things that the nation state has to address. I mean, I've long been an advocate of regulation. I mean, I don't necessarily think that as a company we can really work on the threat of misinformation, right? I mean, we aren't, we don't make our model available as an API for other people to, generate new types of content on. So most of the time we're trying not to contribute to the harms, but we're also not, sort of like actively participating in, releasing new moderation tools or things like that. I mean, I think OpenAI's release recently of the GPT-4 for moderation is excellent. Those kinds of things are awesome. I think Anthropic does lots of cool things like that. I think once we're a little bit bigger and a bit more stable, when we're only 40 people at the moment, we'll add more people doing those kinds of things. But for us, we're trying to build a product that consumers absolutely love, that in and of itself is as safe as it can be, and is really useful and helps people and is super supportive and stuff like that. That's really our goal. And then beyond that, we're advocating for regulation. I think that's the way that this is going to really change.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'll come back to regulation in just a second. But in the book, you talk very positively about the idea of having an Apollo program for technical AI safety research, that just we need to put a lot more effort into this. Yet, does Inflection intend to develop or apply any particular technical AI alignment methods in order to make its models safer, or to develop those methods more in a way that might scale up to even and be useful for even more capable models?
I mean, yes, definitely. I mean, right now, what you see in Pi today is actually one of our smaller models, and soon it will be much, much larger. But the methods for alignment are the same ones that we've all been using to, improve, the controllability and performance of these models. So, obviously, one of the reasons why we've been able to get it to behave so, so closely to our behavior policy is that we basically really fine tune it very aggressively. And we spend a lot of time, doing RLHF on it and, using other methods and so on. So we've definitely advanced the state of the art there. We published a tech report, not detailing too many insights, but describing the results that we've got in our pre-trained model. And we've achieved state-of-the-art performance for our compute size. So compared to GPT 3.5, to Google's Palm, to Claude 1, to Chinchilla, we beat all of those models on most of the public benchmarks like MLU and so on. So on the pre-training side. And actually we've done Similar things, slightly harder to measure and compare on the fine tuning and alignment side. So we haven't published anything on the alignment side, but we've achieved similar state of the art progress there. And soon we'll publish something else on our new pre-training run, which is much larger.
Yeah. Many people, including me, were super blown away by the jump from GPT 3.5 to GPT 4. Do you think people are going to be blown away again in the next year by the leap to these 100x the compute of GPT 4 models?
Well, I think that what people forget is that the difference between 3.5 and 4 is 5x. So it's I guess just because of our human bias, we just assume that this is a tiny increment. It's not. It's a huge multiple of total training flops. So the difference between 4 and 4.5 will itself be enormous. I mean, we're going to be significantly larger than 4 in time as well. Once we're finished with our training run. So, it really is much better. And I think, the exciting thing is that one of the key emergent capabilities at each new order of magnitude in compute is alignment. You look back at GPT-3 and everyone said, well, these models are always going to be racist and toxic and biased and da-da-da-da. Well, it turns out that the larger they get, the better we can, the better job we can do at aligning them and constraining them and getting them to produce extremely nuanced and precise behaviors. That's actually a great story because, that's exactly what we want. We want them to behave as intended. And I think that, that's one of the capabilities that emerge as they get bigger.
Yeah. What do you think of Anthropic's approach to the arms race issue? I guess they're doing a kind of middle ground thing where they try to kind of lead from second place. So if another lab trains something, then they'll train it themselves in order to study it. And if another lab releases something publicly, then they'll do so as well because they figure the cat's out of the bag. But they're reluctant to be the first to train or release anything because they're worried that could make the competitive race somewhat more fierce. Do you think that's just kind of a mistake, or do you see where they're coming from?
I don't think it's true that they're not attempting to be the first to train at scale.
Okay, interesting. Okay, yeah, you don't buy that. That's I mean, have I misunderstood what they think that they're doing?
I don't know. You have to ask them. I mean, I don't want to. I like them very much, and I have huge respect for them. So I don't want to say anything bad if that's what they've said. But also, I think Sam said recently they're not training GPT-5. Come on. I mean, it's just like. I don't know. I think it's better that we're all just straight about it. That's why we disclose the total amount of compute that we've got. It's like, and obviously you can work out from that, roughly speaking, what order of magnitude of flops we're using. It's much better that we're just transparent about it. We're training models that are bigger than GPT-4, right? We have 6,000 H100s in operation today, training models. By December, we will have 22,000 H100s fully operational, and every month, between now and then, we're adding, 1,000 to 2,000 H100s. So people can work out what that enables us to train by spring, by summer of next year, and we'll continue training larger models. And I think that that's the right way to go about it. Just be super open and transparent. I think Google DeepMind should do the same thing. They should declare how many flops Gemini is trained on.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, I'll go back and check what Anthropic says that it's doing in this respect, and I can add a cut in to clarify in case I've gotten the wrong end of the stick. So, as you mentioned earlier, in July, Inflection signed on to 8 voluntary commitments with the White House, including things like committing to internal and external security testing, and investing in cybersecurity and insider threat safeguards, and facilitating third-party discovery and reporting of vulnerabilities. Those are all voluntary, though. What commitments would you like to become legally mandatory for all major AI labs in the US and UK?
That is a good question. So I think some of those voluntary commitments should become legally mandated. Number one would be scale audits, right? What size is your latest model, right? Number two, there needs to be a framework for harmful model capabilities like bioweapons, coaching, nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, general bomb making capabilities. Those things are pretty easy to document, and it just should not be possible to reduce the barriers to entry for people who don't have specialist knowledge to go off and manufacture those things more easily. Those are probably the two immediate ones that spring to mind. I think that there are probably others, but if I were going to make those things legally enforceable, those are the top two. Oh, actually, no, the third one that I have said publicly and that I care a lot about is that we should just declare that these models shouldn't be used for electioneering, right? They just shouldn't be part of the political process. Yeah, you shouldn't be able to ask Pi, who Pi would vote for, or like what the difference is between these two candidates. Now, the counter argument is that many people will say, well, this might be able to provide useful and accurate and valuable information to educate people about elections, etc., etc. Look, there is never going to be a perfect solution here. You have to take benefits away in order to avoid harms. And that's always a trade-off. You can't have perfect, benefits without any harms, right? Like, so that's just a trade-off. I would rather just take it all off the table and
we can put some of it back later on once we understand how to do it safely.
That's the best way. That is totally the best way. Now, obviously, a lot of people say that I'm super naive in claiming that this is possible because, models like Stable Diffusion and Llama 2 are already out in open source, and people will certainly use that for electioneering. Again, this isn't trying to, resolve every single threat vector to our democracy. It's just trying to say, like, at least the large-scale hyperscaler model providers, like Amazon, Microsoft, Google, and others should just say this is against our terms of service, right? So you're just making it a little bit more difficult and maybe even a little bit more taboo if you don't declare that your election materials are human generated only.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, Twitter just banned election advertising on their platform at some point, and I think that made their life a whole lot easier than trying to filter everything extremely carefully. Speaking of Twitter, you've celebrated the UK government's upcoming AI Safety Summit, which is in just a few months. What outcome do you think should be the top priority for the people organizing it, who I think listen to this show, by the way?
Yeah, look, they're all good guys, Ian and Matt and Kate and all those other people. They're all doing a great job. I'm really glad to see the summit. So, look, I think it's an opportunity to, put in place some of the proposals that came out of the voluntary commitments, and maybe put that on a legislative path. Audits, collaboration between the companies to share best practices. I mean, that was one thing I didn't list in the kind of legal requirements thing, because I think that's a bit complicated, but I think it would be good if there was a culture of sharing vulnerabilities and weaknesses, just like, zero-day exploits or other kind of cybersecurity bugs get disclosed confidentially to the companies for, I think, 60 days or so until there's a kind of like public exposure of it. So those are the sorts of things that I think would be really helpful.
Yeah. So yeah, I know you're on the book tour, and I've got to go in just a minute. But maybe one final question or theme is, so I don't quite understand the. It seems like you don't want to talk so much about misalignment or deceptive alignment or like models having their own goals and running out of control. But at the same time, it seems like you agree with me and many other people that could be an issue in 10 or 15, 20 years time. We don't know exactly, but like that will be an issue at some point if the capabilities keep going up. In a sense, like, even if you agree it's not going to be an issue for 10 years, 10 years is not that far away. And it seems like it could be quite a difficult problem to solve. Like, isn't it still quite urgent that people be taking seriously misalignment and trying to figure out how we will address it when it becomes a problem?
Yeah. No, forgive me. I didn't mean to trivialize it. I was more talking about the tactics of talking about these things publicly.
I see. Yeah.
So yeah, 100%. Here's a super critical issue. We need 10x more people focused on misalignment. I mean, in general, I'm a bit sensitive to the idea of deception because I think it's in itself a kind of anthropomorphism. But that's a technicality. I mean, in general, I think absolutely the fundamental questions of misalignment and in general AGI safety and the 10-year risks and the 20-year risks, couldn't be more important. I think more people should be researching it, and I'm always, a big believer in supporting it.
All right. My guest today has been Mustafa Suleyman, and the book is The Coming Wave. I think it's a book that's going to make a significant wave in the media over the next month or two. So yeah, best of luck with the book tour.
Thanks a lot, Rob. I really appreciate it. And thanks for all your work on the podcast. It's super awesome to see all the attention that these issues get. And I think that is in no small part because of the work that you and the rest of the community do to popularize it. So thank you. It's a huge service.
Thanks so much.